Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm sure there'll be a few stragglers coming later, but we have a full program, so I'd like to get this show on the road. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program and the European Studies program here at the center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the center on the first day of the center's academic year. It's a busy place today with lots of new fellows, scholars joining us, and some of them are present here. And the first day of fall activities, and I'm delighted that we have a very special event to start our event program here at the History and Public Policy program. That is an event on the Berlin edition of Willy Brandt's papers, die Berliner Ausgabe. We have a phenomenal panel of speakers, so I'll be real brief, but wanted to just say a couple of words for those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center. The center, of course, is this nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, as both a distinguished leader, distinguished scholar, the only American president so far with a PhD, and a national leader. Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. And it's this what we're trying to commemorate here at the center, the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson, by providing a link between the policy community and the scholarly community, the world of ideas and the world of policy, by fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. We host about 200 scholars from around the world each year and host over 800 meetings on national and international affairs, smaller and larger meetings. The Center's History and Public Policy program seeks to provide historical context to current public policy issues and a forum for the discussion of new, important, significant, policy-relevant historical findings and publications. And in fact, I would argue the Willy Brandt Berliner Ausgabe is such a publication that ought to be introduced to an English-speaking audience. Many of you are familiar with the Cold War International History Project, one of the activities we run out of this program. More information on all of that at the Wilson Center's website, wilsoncenter.org, or for the Cold War Project materials, cwihp.org. Let me, before I introduce the speakers, do a round of thanks to our co-sponsors of this event. Of course, the Bundeskanzler Willy Brandt Stiftung, represented here by Dr. Rother and Dr. Vogt. The German Historical Institute, represented here by Dr. Markus Gräser, and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Washington office. The director, Pierre Bungarten, is here over there. My thanks to you as well for co-sponsoring this event, and of course to Ambassador Dean for agreeing at very short notice to join us for this event to give a personal and ad hoc perspective on Willy Brandt and perhaps the edition as well. Just a couple of logistical remarks. We are webcasting this event live. The event will be available in our online archive in a week or so. And later on, when we'll get into a discussion with all of you, I hope, please wait for the microphone so that our viewers can also understand. And please turn off your cell phones now, if you would. With that, let me briefly introduce the speakers. After a brief introduction by Markus Gräser, the Deputy Director of the German Historical Institute, we will turn it over to Bernd Rother, the Vice Executive Director of the Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt Foundation. He has been in that office since 1999 and has, prior to that position, occupied a number of distinguished positions in institutions such as the Moses Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies in Potsdam, the Institute for Social History in Bonn, the University of Hannover, and a host of others. His main areas of research focus on the history of the SPD and the Socialist International, and I'm delighted to see that he has been involved in this important collection, and delighted to see that he has time besides his tasks in managing the foundation to find time for research. Our second speaker, Brandt will talk a little bit about the foundation and the document edition. Our second speaker then will give more personal and historical commentary, and we're thrilled to have with us one of Germany's leading foreign policy and security experts, Dr. Carsten Vogt, who from 1999 until 2009 for decades served as coordinator of German-North American cooperation at the German Federal Foreign Office. Prior to this appointment, he's held positions within the SPD, the Party of European Socialists, the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, and of course, he served as a member of the German Bundestag for many years. I won't go into all of the distinguished awards and positions that he's held over the years, just to say that we're thrilled that he can join us for this launch today. Finally, then, Ambassador Jonathan Dean will provide comments as well. He, of course, has had a long, distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving all the way back in the U.S. High Commission and the early days of the Bonn government. He really personifies German-American relations history, and of course, in the 70s and 80s, served at the NATO Warsaw Pact force reduction negotiations in Vienna, as well as other important positions, capping his career at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as associate, and then more recently as an advisor to the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ambassador Dean will provide some personal comments, and then I hope we'll get fairly quickly into discussion with all of you. Your questions and comments will be very welcome. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Gräser for some brief introductory remarks on behalf of the German Historical Institute.
Thank you, Christian. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and a real privilege for the German Historical Institute to co-host today's launch of the document collection Willy Brandt, Berlin edition. We always like to cooperate with the Wilson Center, especially with its Cold War International History Project, under the direction of Christian Ostermann. And we also value our relationship with the Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt Foundation. In 2003, on the 10th anniversary of Willy Brandt's death, a portrait of Brandt by the noted German artist Johannes Heisig was unveiled at the German Historical Institute. This painting was commissioned by the Bundeskanzler Willy Brandt Stiftung, and we now have it on permanent loan from the Freundeskreis Willy Brandt House in Berlin. It is quite a moving portrait that tries to capture Brandt's wit and generosity. We are proud to have it adorn our lecture room. So, if you would like to see it, come to one of our next lectures. For more information, just visit our website www.ghi-dc.org. The German Historical Institute here in Washington, D.C. is, first of all, a center for advanced study that serves as a transatlantic bridge connecting American and European scholars. Although particularly dedicated to fostering the study of German history in North America and American history in Germany, our research and conferences range beyond German and American history to encompass comparative, transnational, and global history, as well as research in the fields of economics, sociology, and political science. Now, historians prefer concepts that help us to comprehend the role of personality in history. One of these ideas is called charisma. I once experienced firsthand what charisma is and how it works, and I will never forget that. In early 1990, I was part of a huge crowd gathering on the market square of Gotha, a mid-sized town in what was then still East Germany, the German Democratic Republic as it was called. But the Berlin Wall had been torn down a couple of months before, and leaders like Willy Brandt were speaking to East German citizens. Brandt had no official governmental or party function at that time, but he was quite well known and he could count on a massive audience. I was standing next to a building and far away from the platform where Brandt was speaking, so I could barely see him. Behind me was a woman with her young son, who she was desperately trying to put on her shoulders in order to show him Willy Brandt. She was finally able to move the child to a windowsill upon which he could stand upright and, I think, finally see the famous man. His mother was holding him firmly on that windowsill, and she could not see Willy Brandt. But she constantly whispered to her son, "Look at him. This is the man. This is Willy Brandt. Can you see him? Look at him." Until that moment, the concept of charisma, which mostly tries to describe a certain bond that connects the charismatic person to a group of people, remained for me a phenomenon that I had only read about in my books. But now on the marketplace in Gotha, I understood that special atmosphere, that instant connection that a charismatic person like Willy Brandt could establish with people he had never even seen before. But I'm sure that Bernd Rother and Carsten Vogt will be able to talk in a much more profound way about Brandt's personality and his role in history. Thank you for coming to this book launch, and it's time to turn the mic over to Bernd Rother.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me too first express my gratitude to Christian Ostermann and his staff for the excellent work preparing this event, and of course my gratitude to Ambassador Jonathan Dean for joining us in this presentation. My thanks go also to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Washington, D.C., and the German Historical Institute here as co-sponsors, and finally to Carsten Vogt, who has come with me from Berlin to join us in this presentation. Willy Brandt once defined journalists as a sub-branch of the wood processing industry. Being journalist by profession, he knew what he was talking about. As politician, he continued his love for processed wood, writing letters and memos rather than making phone calls. And from early on, he never forgot to file the papers, or later on let his staff file them. For historians, this has brought the great opportunities to study his political legacy on 400 meters of archived papers, covering nearly his entire political life, from 1940 on, when he fled from Norway to Sweden to escape the German invasion without any important gap. To publish selected documents from the Willy Brandt archives was one of the most important tasks the Bundeskanzler Willy Brandt Stiftung Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt Foundation had to fulfill after being established. But before going into details of the Berlin edition, let me first briefly introduce our foundation. The Brandt Foundation was created by a federal law which passed the German parliament, the Bundestag, in 1994, without any vote against. We are a non-partisan institution. This is important because usually our first-time visitors think that we are an institution of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. In reality, we are one of 5 national memorial foundations for German statesmen. The Brandt Foundation began its work in 1995. Today, 8 employees work for the foundation in Berlin, 4 in Brandt's birthplace Lübeck, among them historians and museum educators. Funds for operating expenses come from the budget of the Federal Government Commissioner for Cultural Affairs and the Media in the Federal Chancellor's office. Our main purpose is to keep the memory of Willy Brandt alive. Our work centers primarily on historical research and political education. We carry out this task in particular through permanent exhibits at our 2 locations in Berlin and Lübeck. A new exhibition to be opened in the German capital in 2012 will commemorate not only Brandt's dedication to the freedom of the once divided city, but also his achievements as foreign minister and as Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. And last but surely not least, we publish selected documents and papers by Willy Brandt and conduct research about him and the past century. We cooperate with domestic and foreign researchers and institutions, as we do now, and hold workshops and conferences. In addition, we support young scholars with their projects. Every other year, we honor outstanding achievements in research with the Willy Brandt Prize. By the way, for the Willy Brandt Prize, we do accept works written in English. Our foundation does not hold the Brandt papers. They form the Willy Brandt archives in the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's Archives of Social Democracy in Bonn, which maintains the complete written legacy of Willy Brandt. With its 400 linear meters of files, the Brandt archive in Bonn is one of the largest material legacies of any post-war German political leader. The 10-volume Berliner Ausgabe, finished last year, is intended first and foremost for a broad historically, politically interested public. The edition is arranged according to chronological and thematic subjects. In each volume, the most diverse sources are brought together. Among them, Willy Brandt's letters, notes, interviews, manuscripts of speeches, and memoranda. Each volume begins with an extensive and easily understandable, we hope easily understandable, introduction to the theme between 50 and 100 pages. The Berlin edition is therefore not conceived as a mere collection of documents. Rather, it is intended to facilitate the reader's critical access to the life and the politics of Willy Brandt, as well as to significant segments of 20th century history. The 10 volumes will be completed in upcoming years with the series Willy Brandt Documents. And as a further completion of the Berlin edition, the Foundation, in spring 2006, has launched a new publication series named Willy Brandt Studien Studies. Let me now try to resume very briefly the Berlin edition. Some figures. 904 documents, 745 pages of introductions, subject and name index add up to about 5,000 pages. You have it there. As a sample, we have chosen 22 documents from 1971 to 1991 dealing with international relations, East-West and North-South, which were translated into English and will be posted on the Cold War International History Project's website. You are invited to read them as a sort of appetizer. If you want to buy all the 10 volumes, they now are available at the very special rate of 188 euros, 10 volumes. The order form is on your table. But what are the main findings of these 10 volumes? I will try to highlight what, in my view, are the most important insights. The first 2 volumes deal with Willy Brandt's youth and his exile, first in Norway, from where he moved to Sweden in 1940. In Scandinavia, he, who had started as a revolutionary socialist, learned to appreciate parliamentary democracy and reformism. Both volumes also show that Brandt's position towards the Soviet Union vacillated during this time. Albeit never tempted to join the Communist Party, there were phases when he saw the Soviet Union as an interesting, although imperfect, social model and judged its international role positively. But the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Hitler-Stalin Pact, led Brandt to sharply criticize Moscow. Only the German aggression in June 1941 changed his position, and in doing so, he was representative for the vast majority of the non-communist left. At the end of the war, until 1946, Brandt hoped for internal reforms toward more freedom in the Soviet Union. What we today might see as pure illusion was then a widespread hope in and outside the Soviet Union, nurtured by various hints which came from Moscow. Prague 1948 destroyed the last doubts Brandt might have had about the nature of communist strategy. Volume 3 on Brandt and Berlin, he was mayor of this town from 1957 to 1966, demonstrates that his strategy of small steps to improve relations with the East and to alleviate the lot of all who suffered from the German division took shape not only after the construction of the Berlin Wall, but even earlier. But of course, it was put into practice after 1961, when the Berlin Wall was erected. Volumes 4 and 5 describe Brandt's 23 years term as a chairman of the SPD, a time span unequaled by any other SPD leader, including the mythic August Bebel. For me, Brandt's central message to his party was to avoid party splits and to integrate new political generations and new political ideas, provided that they would enrich and not destroy the idea of democratic socialism. This was far from self-evident. In his youth, Brandt himself had experienced a party split. His conclusion was that both parts, the majority as well as the minority, came out weakened. When Brandt took up to integrate democratically minded 68ers, he met with Helmut Schmidt's resistance, who feared that the SPD would go the Italian way, divided into a socialist and a social democratic wing. To integrate relevant parts of the extra-parliamentary movement of 1968 was one of Brandt's achievements when we look at the party. Another was to open the SPD for ecological problems in the 1980s, thus preparing the ground for later red-green coalitions. Here too, he had to overcome strong resistance in his own party. And Brandt's third success was that until 1981, not 82, 81, the vast majority of the SPD stood behind Helmut Schmidt's government. The social-liberal coalition broke apart when Schmidt's traditional supporters in the trade unions turned away. Volume 7 on domestic and societal policies hopefully does away with the idea that Brandt was not interested in these themes. Of course, his passion belonged to international relations. But he knew that he had to deal with many domestic problems when he really wanted to reform Germany, and so he did. Volume 8 presents the least known stage of Brandt's political life, when he was president of the Socialist International from 1976 to 1992, and when he chaired the North-South Commission. Have a look at any biography on Brandt and you see that the respective chapter is always the weakest. But I don't want to put the blame on the biographers. They have to rely on articles and monographs, and until we published Volume 8 there was no real account and analysis of these questions. Paul Wilkinson calls the Brandt report on North-South problems, I quote, the last really serious effort at designing a comprehensive international development strategy." End of quote. As president of the Socialist International, Brandt tried to establish social democracy as a third global model between communism and capitalism. At least he succeeded to transform the International into a respected partner on the international scene and to extend its memberships beyond Europe. That after his death, the International soon fell again into oblivion proves how important the personal factor, the Brandt factor, had been. And Ostpolitik? It ranks among the most studied topics in contemporary history. Therefore, there are not really news in the edition concerning Ostpolitik's first phase until 1974. The respective volumes fully confirm what Anne Dayton wrote in her review of Tony Judd's post-war, I quote, "It was only the West Germans who could bring about a systemic sea change through an Ostpolitik that was mirrored by continual support for West European integration in all the institutions of European Community, the Council of Europe, Western European Union, and of course NATO." End of quote. But I especially recommend to you Volume 10, which sheds new light on Brandt's foreign policy between 1982, when the SPD was forced to leave the government, and his death in 1992. In the first half of the 1980s, to save peace and détente became Brandt's overriding motive. The problem is that the relations with East European dissidents, especially with the Polish Solidarity, were relegated to the fringe. Solidarność sometimes was more seen as destabilizing peace than as destabilizing communism. But in the summer and autumn of 1989, Brandt was one of the first German political leaders to realize that a revolution was starting in the East. And from November 1989 on, he aimed at the unification of Germany, contrary to many of his comrades. After the end of the bipolar world, Brandt had some surprises for his party. He favored a stronger international commitment of Germany, which could include the participation of Bundeswehr soldiers in armed UN missions. The preparation of the 1991 SPD party conference showed that his and this position was only shared by a minority of the party. I will leave it at this. I hope that I could give you an idea of what we are doing at the Willy Brandt Foundation and what the Berlin edition is about. I invite you to buy and read the 10 volumes or visit us in Berlin unter den Linden. Entrance to our exhibition is free, but unfortunately the flight to Berlin is not. Thank you. Carsten Vogt has the floor.
Thank you, Bernd. Brandt's life covered, as we just heard, and the edition covers a lot of aspects. We felt that it was important in this context, in this institution, in this town, to talk in particular about Brandt's international policies, and in particular his view of the U.S.-German relationship in the United States. And there's nobody who can better talk about this than Carsten Vogt. So, Dr. Vogt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. When I was asked to say some words about Willy Brandt's view on the United States, this was really a challenge, because at the same time I had practically to analyze my own position during that period. And therefore, I very often, when I read these documents, and an excellent dissertation of roughly 600 pages of Judith Michow on Brandt's views on the United States, which just appeared, I always had to think about my own memory, and sometimes the facts being written in the documents confirmed my views, and 10 times, naturally, my views were corrected. I have known Willy Brandt since 1969. I have discussed the periods before that time very often. This period in Spain, when he was in the Civil War, you didn't mention that.
Yeah. Such a rich life.
Yes. Especially the period in Scandinavia, because his wife was Norwegian, and I personally speak Norwegian and a little bit of Swedish. My basic language is Danish. And so we communicated very often about this time as well. And when I first was at his home, his wife said to him, Willy Brandt, Willy, in Norman, another Northman. Northman. So I was at this background as well. But I must admit that my first meeting with Willy Brandt was a disaster. The charisma which he obviously had, I discovered it much, much later. It went in such a wrong direction in the early 1970s that I got another invitation by our federal president, Heinemann, who wanted to influence me as a young socialist. And I obviously behaved at that time in a way in which he behaved when he met other social democrats in the 30s. Anyhow, in her introduction, Judith Michel writes that Willy Brandt's view of the United States changed various times over the years. This does not come as a surprise, but it has to be added that also the United States changed during those decades and years. And therefore, Willy Brandt was also reacting in his behavior in a certain way against the background of a specific US policy which was either close to him or which was in opposition to his own views. From my own experience, I can understand how he must have thought during the Vietnam War. But he didn't express it at that time. And because of the interest of Berlin, the security interest of Berlin at that time. And therefore, I was at that time very much frustrated that he didn't express his views in a critical way towards the United States and about the United States. And my views at that time were rather critical, if not negative. But some people being here can confirm it. And on the other side, his view about the US during the German unification process was more positive than that of most Germans. And I supported his view at that time in opposition to the party leadership, at that time under Oskar Lafontaine, who now is leading or has been leading a different party. There's also a big difference whether a young socialist like Willy Brandt in the 30s and like myself in the 60s compare the US with his own aspiration for a German-style democratic socialism, or if he, as was the case for Willy Brandt in his early years in Berlin in the 40s, or for myself in the 60s and the 70s, work in the federal parliament, and then you have primarily to concentrate on state interest and foreign policy interest. During the World War II, and even in the early years after the war, Willy Brandt wrote reports to the Stockholm Embassy of the United States. He also indirectly wrote reports to the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, which, by the way, at that time was typical for quite a number of German left-wing immigrants. And I had the pleasure, in an ironic situation, when I was coordinator for German-American cooperation, that the American ambassador at that time, a Republican, handed over a medal to the families of young left-wing communists or socialists who were working for the CIA in London and later on in Germany, and some of them were killed, and who got the medal and because they gave information to the Americans. And these people who got the medal were all former communists from East Germany. So there is, one has to understand the time and the period of that time. At that time, people, because of their anti-fascism, very often were vague in the criticism of communism. This came later, as you rightly described it. And on the other side, they had no barrier of cooperating with the CIA, which normally, under present circumstances, would be viewed in a totally negative way. But he did it because he wanted to do something for democratic post-war Germany. But this cooperation, even at that time, never excluded that he had a critical stance towards the United States whenever its politics did not match his own convictions. Therefore, the young Willy Brandt, just as myself when I was young, were somewhat torn between the praise of democracy and freedom in the US and criticism of the negative impacts of American capitalism. By the way, this is a position many young socialists, young social democrats even have today. I was present at the, now being not invited, they didn't want to kill the father, now they invited me as the grandfather, so to say. They invited me to their Congress, and exactly that was expressed in a certain way during that conference again. This ambivalence of one side, being critical of certain aspects of US policy and societal aspects of US society, and at the same time seeing the US as a guarantor for freedom. At my generation, this is different today, they trusted even the stability of American democracy more than the stability of German post-war democracy. This conflictual relationship ended for Willy Brandt, as you rightly were saying, with the beginning of the Cold War, at latest. And he was positioning himself along the lines with the Americans, and more general with Western foreign policies. Richard Löwenthal, one of the teachers in a certain way of the young Willy Brandt, called this the Atlanticist left. And in a certain way, Willy Brandt at that time became an Atlanticist and a social democrat at the same time. He was pro-American, more pro-American than many other social democrats at that time. He already was seen as being very pro-American in 1954 when he first came to the United States. But this was very much due to the situation in Berlin and because of the security of Berlin. But it didn't mean that he lost the interest in societal relationship and social developments inside the US. But the importance of the US for the security of Berlin, Germany, Western Europe had the priority over his interest in the social political developments in the United States. And again, therefore, he didn't criticize the US foreign policy, even when I thought at that time it was needed. On the other hand, after Willy Brandt resigned as Chancellor, as President, and became President of the Socialist International and Chairman of the North-South Commission, he was often far more outspoken and critical with regard to the alarming developments in Africa and Latin America than myself. And I was at that time member of the Bundestag and was working in the North Atlantic Assembly, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So I was looking at the US very often through the lens of the East-West conflict. And he was looking at the US through the lens of the North-South policy of the US. And therefore, at that time and during that time, sometimes he was more critical of the US, strange enough, than I was. And when I was asked by him to, on his behalf, to go to Washington, Mexico, Nicaragua, and later on to the Vatican, to try to convince people that a concept for a peaceful solution of the conflicts in El Salvador and Nicaragua was needed. at that time, he was very, very hopeful about the Carter administration. I think sometimes too hopeful, and very, very critical later on of the Reagan administration. In some cases, during that period, he viewed the security policy of the Soviet Union during the Brezhnev years, late Brezhnev years, occasionally less skeptical than I did it. And this had very much to do with this changed perspective seen from the North-South, dimension of North-South, and also how the Reagan administration treated him. That the Reagan administration did not like the Socialist International is understandable and clear. But Jerry Livingston will remember it. In 1980, there was a conference here in Washington, which was planned already during the Carter years, and then started and was implemented during the early months of the Reagan administration, called Eurosocialism and the US. And there were a lot of leaders, social democrat leaders from Western Europe, a couple of them being head of governments. None of them was received by the Reagan administration. And they were treated with contempt. And my own sentiment was that after that type of treatment, Willy Brandt became afterwards more critical of the Reagan administration and of the US than before. And this, what did contribute to that fact even more was that as chairman of the party and as chairman of the Socialist International, he naturally in Eastern Europe, and especially also in the Soviet Union, was treated as if he was a head of government. So in this, there was an obvious conflict between his role, how it was perceived in the East, and his role, how it was perceived in Washington at that time. There were words between the confetti parade with which the population of New York welcomed Willy Brandt in 1959 on Broadway, and the contempt he was treated with by the Reagan administration in 1980. As the governing mayor of Berlin, his relationship to the US seemed sometimes closer and friendlier than that of the federal chancellor at that time, Konrad Adenauer. On the other hand, when Willy Brandt declared his opposition to the deployment of American medium-range missiles on the occasion of a demonstration of the peace movement in 1983, you mentioned that date, because in 1982 he still was supporting the dual track, the US and conservatives in Germany accused him of anti-Americanism because of his criticism of the politics of the then US administration. In both cases, what mattered for Willy Brandt, and there I see a common denominator, was his perception of German interest. That was the benchmark which he applied when judging the respective American administration, their policies as governing mayor in Berlin and as party leader of the SPD. During the Berlin crisis and at the height of the Cold War, Willy Brandt considered the support by American policies as a vital condition to safeguard the security and freedom of Berlin. At that time, when the Berlin Wall was built, he would have wished a stronger reaction by the Kennedy administration. And so he was on the tough side. As for myself, Willy Brandt's decisive stance when the wall was built, as well as the early beginning of his concept of the policy of détente, have been an important reason to join the SPD in 1962. On the other hand, in 1983, Willy Brandt feared that the policies of the Reagan administration would endanger the achievement of the policy of détente for Berlin, and that the relationship between the two parts of Germany would be at risk. In a certain way, during Bush II, George W. Bush administration, we had a conflict in the United States and in Germany between those in the United States who were dominating, the children of Reagan, who thought that their policy had decided the Cold War and ended the world Cold War under Western conditions, and a predominant view in Germany among the children of Willy Brandt that the deterrent policy had ended the Cold War under favorable conditions. In that sense, the different narratives are formed about the history of foreign policy matter. They do not only matter historically, they do also matter how people judge certain behavior. Take the example of Connie Rice saying that the American policy after the end of World War II was for her an example for her policies in Iraq. So the memory matters. And at that time, Kissinger considered Willy Brandt to be nationalistic when he defended this policy of his against an American administration, which is a little bit ironic because I've listened to Kissinger very often and talked with him relatively often, but I've never discovered an enormous amount of idealism in his personal attitude when he decided how he should pursue American interest. Although Willy Brandt, as a young socialist and later on as a party leader, had certainly felt a greater affinity to the political ideas of the Democrats than those of the Republicans, as the governing mayor of Berlin and later on as chancellor, he has also maintained good relationship with the more liberal Republicans. By the way, this is since then a continuous policy of the Social Democratic Party to have a bipartisan relationship with the United States, at least to try to have a bipartisan relationship with the United States. It's not always easy. As negative as his assessment of the Reagan administration was, and might have been, he had a very positive view of George Bush during the German unification process. And during that time, he trusted the American administration more than Mitterrand and Thatcher. For good reasons, I must say, during those years. During the last years of his life, Willy Brandt made numerous positive comments about the US and its policy, by the way, also about NATO, about sending German troops abroad, all that, very positive views about it. And he had the hope that the Bush administration will not only end the East-West conflict and not only end the division of Germany but also of Europe as a whole, and that the division of Europe as a whole could be overcome by the policy of the then American administration and by Gorbachev on the Soviet side. But even when he was criticizing the US during those years, Willy Brandt never stopped considering himself as a part of the free democratic tradition of the West and hence of the US. With this basic position, Willy Brandt embodied, despite his individual path through life and his personality, a long tradition of the Social Democratic Party, which, by the way, since its creation in the 19th century, which was very often forgotten, was very pro-American. Wilhelm Liebknecht, no American will know him, but he was not Karl Marx, but Wilhelm Liebknecht was one of the founders, together with people, of the Social Democratic Party. He once even considered to go into exile to the United States, but he always thought and said that the US was the most free country in the world. And during the Weimar time, the SPD was criticized because of its relatively pro-American position by the extreme right, but naturally also by the communists. And after World War I, the Social Democrats had cherished great expectation insofar as Woodrowism was concerned. They had great expectation. They expressed these great expectations. They wanted an American engagement in Europe. But I must honestly say, to a very great extent, these expectations were not met after World War I. Nonetheless, pro-American tendencies continued to dominate in the SPD. At the same time, Social Democrats had a reservation when the US acted as a leading power of capitalism. As a young socialist, I would have described it. This critical element within a generally positive view of America, was also part of Willy Brandt's image of the U.S. when he found himself in exile in Scandinavian countries. I think that this typical combination of criticism on a specific issue and a basically positive attitude towards the United States is typical also for the present generation. It is typical, for example, that foreign policy specialists view the U.S. primarily under foreign policy auspices, but the grassroots people in the Social Democratic Party view the U.S. primarily under domestic auspices. And, surprise, surprise, the popularity rate of Obama still is about roughly 80% in Germany.
That's the spirit.
And what?
That's the spirit. Yeah.
No, and it will change again a little bit after the next election, I think. But there you see that for a party as a movement, as for Willy Brandt in his youth, and for Willy Brandt when he was an elder statesman, society aspect of U.S. policies play a bigger role. When you are in government, when you have to decide about foreign policy issues, then naturally day-to-day issues of foreign policy play a greater role. By the way, I think this is also typical for the U.S. side. Even on the U.S. side, many friends of the United States, of Germany, criticize Germany very often, and this is only normal because we both reflect different historical experience and narratives, but we represent similar, but sometimes even identical values and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carsten Vogt, for this very insightful presentation. And thank you also for your contributions to the German-American relationship over the years. And it's in a similar sense, we should be grateful to Ambassador Dean, who, as I mentioned at the outset, very impromptu, at very short notice, has agreed to give some remarks. He has not had the luxury of leafing through, or not to speak of reading, the volumes. So he will provide some brief personal comments, and we're delighted that he's here joining us today. Ambassador.
Thank you. The presentation of the Willy Brandt Berliner Ausgabe is a major event because it conclusively documents the central positive role which Willy Brandt played ending the Cold War in Europe and in bringing about the unification of Europe. As with many here, the main events of my adult life were the rise of Hitler, World War II, the division of Europe, and the Cold War, which seemed the permanent background of life in the 20th century. And so I agreed with the pastor of my small church in McLean, Virginia, when he insisted that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the peaceful end of the Cold War was a divine miracle. And so it was. Yet it was not a sudden, miraculous event, but the outcome of patient, persistent proposals by Willy Brandt and his colleagues. These men made it their life work to show that there was a negotiated way out. The documents in this series show that Brandt and his colleagues succeeded in a remarkable feat in convincing successive leaders of the Soviet Union and of the East German Communist Party, who had been prepared to defend their position with ultimate violence, that a negotiated outcome was possible. By persistent argument over the years, they showed the East German leadership that the main tenets of their ideological faith were wrong, and that there was an honorable way out for them, not involving court trials and imprisonment. They convinced the Soviet leaders that although their own views contained many humane corrections of capitalism, they could not succeed in maintaining their system in Europe without vast and bloody use of force, which would discredit them permanently. These documents report how the Soviet leaders made it known to the leaders of the East German Communist Party that the Soviet Union would not intervene on their behalf with military force. Once this point was made, it seeped through the system, and the Soviet structure was at an end. The German population in West and East demonstrated its opposition to maintaining the status quo by force of arms, and did so in a way that proved to Soviet leaders that Germany had fundamentally changed since 1945. We owe deep thanks to the Willy Brandt Foundation for publishing this record and making it a central part of the history of our time. It shows men and women of today throughout the world that they owe deep thanks to the memory of Willy Brandt. Thank you.
All right. We have some time for questions and comments. And if you could please wait for the microphone and identify yourself, and if you'd like, state your affiliation in Wilson Center tradition. So we'll go right here. Dieter Detke. Yeah.
Yes, Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you for publishing this wonderful document. I'm looking at it right there, and it somehow represents the importance of Willy Brandt just by the weight and the number of volumes. So congratulations on this. A comment and a question. The comment is to Carsten. I want to congratulate Carsten on this great portrait of Willy Brandt's position vis-à-vis the United States and how he saw the U.S. I think you were absolutely right. If there's one thing to add, Carsten, I would say the role of Kennedy and Brandt. I think that's critical. I mean, that was probably the highlight of his pro-American phase, and the importation of campaign techniques and how he appeared in TV. And I mean, Kennedy was his model. And in a deeper sense, too, not only, copying somehow the appearance, in a deeper sense, too, Kennedy was his model, and that I would like to add. And then on Reagan, you're absolutely right. That was a kind of breaking point. And if I may add a personal experience, because I was head of the Ebert Foundation between 1985 and 2006, and I had a chance to work with Willy Brandt during that time after 1985 and the Reagan administration. And just one little footnote to show that you're right, that there was a break. His sense of protocol, was when he came to Washington, he preferred to be and work with the United Nations in New York, of course, but he came to Washington, and I was offering to make an appointment with the Reagan administration. And he would not do that. His sense of protocol told him that when I am here as the former Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, I should be invited to the White House or the State Department. It is not my obligation to ask for an appointment. I think that underlies and emphasizes a little bit, his sense of protocol and who he was, what he stood for, and he sensed, of course, the deep split over Nicaragua and all that. So congratulations on that. Just this little footnote to you, what kind of person he was. The question that I have is probably to Dr. Rother, and that is, I would be interested to see what the addition was able to find out about Brandt's stepping down as a chancellor. There was a time when I joined the SPD parliamentary group as a foreign policy advisor, and I got some background about it. But it's still a huge mystery, wrapped in a puzzle and all of that. You know, who was it? Who is the culprit? Genscher, you know, who let him run into an open knife. Wehner, who pushed him in several directions. And let me advance my own theory. my own theory is Willy Brandt himself. I think because of his oversensitivity, he took responsibility at a time and at a point when he could easily, I think, have continued as chancellor. Had he had the stamina of Kohl, for example, he would have pushed this through. And he could have been a great chancellor because, you know, he, for the first time, the SPD scored a majority in parliament in 1972. So he had all the legitimacy of power, and had he had more stamina, he could have pushed it through. But what kind of light did you shed on this mystery of him stepping down at a time when he didn't have to really? So can you give us a good answer to that?
Thank you, Dieter. Bernd first.
Difficult question, and you asked for a good answer. So we couldn't shed new light on this mystery, especially because the decisive meeting between Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, and Herbert Wehner, which took place in Bad Münstereifel at a regularly scheduled meeting of the SPD leadership. About this meeting, there are no notes. There are some versions known, but no one made out of this a written minutes or something like this. So I would join your interpretation that finally it was he himself who, with his sense of sensibility, it was his sensibility, his personal sensibility, decided not to go through this very problematic, possibly or certainly very problematic future, at least in the next months. But let me add one fact and one facet. The fact is, you should remember that, of course, in November 1972, he scored a historical victory for the SPD, and it was he himself who was the most important factor for this victory. We have it here. Vote Willy, Willy wählen. This is the most important reliquia of the 1972, of the famous 1972 election campaign, which is in the for the history of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the most celebrated election campaign. All hope to score another, once again such a result. But in 74, April-May 74, all polls showed that with Willy Brandt at the head of the party as a candidate for chancellorship in 76 against Helmut Kohl, the SPD would be defeated. And I think, I think that only with Helmut Schmidt, the SPD had the chance, and they succeeded, to win the 76 Bundestag election on a very narrow margin. 49% got the CDU. It was a very narrow margin. And directly after the stepping down of Willy Brandt, we had the Niedersachsen, Lower Saxony elections, which were only won, also by a very small margin, because of not of the stepping down, but the change from Willy Brandt to Helmut Schmidt, which gave the party a new push. Not inside the party, but from the point of view of the public opinion. The facet. Don't forget that at this time, in spring 1974, in the United States, it was discussed whether Richard Nixon should step down voluntarily or if there should be an impeachment. This was an international discussion. And perhaps Willy Brandt didn't want to imitate Richard Nixon with a prolonged discussion over responsibilities, even if it's not comparable. And so he took a decision, contrary to the decision which took, at least in this time, Richard Nixon to try to stand against all evidence as the president. And so this is a context we should not forget. And it's ironically that Richard Nixon sent a telegram to Willy Brandt after Willy Brandt had stepped down as Chancellor, expressing his feelings. Well, I don't think that there were serious, real feelings, but he sent a telegram to Willy Brandt. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just follow up on this issue about the lack of documentation on the decision to step down. Are there any other, in terms of the collection, are there any other cases where you and the other editors and Bearbeiter really wanted to get your fingers on documents and either could not because they did not exist, or could not because they were not declassified or not accessible for some other reason? So are there any major gaps in the documentation in this series?
If I remember well, there aren't such gaps besides the May 74 problematic. Of course, sometimes we would have liked to have still more evidence. But as you know, political leaders by nature prefer to talk to each other, perhaps via phone calls, but not to produce too much of written papers which could be cited afterwards by enemies or historians or journalists. It doesn't matter. This would sometimes produce some risk, but in general, I think that we could reconstruct how decisions were made, why, who took which stance. So
one exception,
yeah?
I would say. The one exception which exists is the so-called Sechserkreis.
Oh yeah, of course. But this is a very special case, but
it's
important.
Special case. It's an important case. It's the informal presidium of the party on international affairs. And Willy Brandt was sharing it, and the Chancellor's office was represented by Wisniewski, Emke, Bar, I myself, and one or two others. And the Effort Foundation was there. And there was deliberately no protocol. Yeah. And during those meetings, we decided and looked into the eyes of some people being present when some money had to be transferred in the specific direction. And we decided who was sent to which part of the world and with what we did. And it was always because we were not clear whether certain other meetings were, so to say, secret enough. And therefore, we, in this circle, when we were dealing with certain international issues, which also included the Socialist International, but also sometimes action, which nowadays would be described as clandestine work, when it was difficult in Eastern Europe, it was difficult in Western Europe, in Portugal, in Spain, there were deliberately no protocol.
Thank you. We have several people. I have several people on my list. The gentleman, and I think you had. Did you have a question as well? If you could please wait for a microphone, and we'll actually just pass it on down to your neighbor.
Yes, thank you. Tom Hansen, University of Minnesota. Willy Brandt was in favor of unification. What was his position on Germany and NATO? Was that a very important part of his position? He passed away, of course, before Bill Clinton reversed the Bush policy and began expanding NATO. Are there any adumbrations we have from Willy Brandt of how he would have approached NATO expansion?
We have to distinguish it. One element which is real and the other element which is speculative, because NATO enlargement is something different than Germany's integration in NATO. This was a subject which we discussed among ourselves and was deeply debated, and the problem was that there was a deep division inside the party on that issue. And Willy Brandt was clear, like many others, that Germany should not go a national way. Therefore, relatively early, the option of neutrality was out, because it meant to go a national way, which was not so clear for many other people. But that in the end of '89, people at that time could not envisage that the Soviet Union would accept a NATO membership. And therefore, in January 90, prior to the Ottawa meeting, I remember that vividly, was in the NSC where I met Bob Blackwell, and they prepared the 2+4. And I had a meeting with Willy Brandt afterwards. And at that time, I believed and tried to communicate that with Brandt with success, that there was a possibility to get Germany inside NATO, not to postpone the unification process, which we didn't want. And I remember it so vividly because I was at that time speaker on the security conference in Munich on behalf of the SPD. And in the written version of my text, I still have the word, we want an all-European peace order, because you need time for translation. While after that meeting in Washington and the discussion with Willy Brandt, I changed my views after consulting with him on that subject and had a different rhetoric during the conference. So this is, sometimes very often you forget the context, but because this time I went back, I know when the one date was, when the next date was, the Munich conference, and in between I had this meeting with Willy Brandt, so I knew that I changed my own opinion, and Willy Brandt changed his opinion, and I know that, to put it that way, Egon Bahr was more reluctant to accept that point of view.
Let me add.
Thank you.
Let me add one point.
Oscar Lafontaine was a totally different trip. He was not part of the discussion anymore with Willy Brandt at that time.
Let me add one point. During the 80s and still in 89, at least this is my impression from the documents, I don't have first-hand experience as you, I think Willy Brandt had the vision that the CSCE or the OSCE structure would serve as a fundamentum to create a new all-European, pan-European security structure in a long process. In 1991, he expressed his disappointment about the incapacity of OSCE to serve in this way. And he stated that after this experience, that the OSCE was not able to create a new European security structure, we have no choice than to go ahead with the NATO structure. And this already implies saying that NATO will serve as a framework for a European security structure, implies that he perhaps had in mind already that Eastern European states might join this, I won't say the NATO, but this European security structure, which in fact was NATO.
At that time it was about cooperation, not about membership.
Yeah,
no, it was more than that. But it honestly said, this was NATO membership was not discussed in '91.
Yeah, important for him was this coordination council with Russia.
Yeah, this was very much, and you have to see that in starting with 1990, the discussion among some of us was that what we originally envisaged, the OSCE on one side, and the cooperation between existing structures like Comecon and EU were no longer valid because they disappeared and were not accepted by the East Europeans. So then we started to think about that the cooperation with Western institutions could be a way of integrating Eastern Europe. But it was not membership. Membership started in 1992, by the way, 92, this discussion, not in 91.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
Thank you. Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Obviously, there have been a lot of references here to Brandt's commitment to peace, but also a brief reference to an exception to that, which is the summer of 1961, when the wall was built. Now, in the mid-'80s, when I was director in the Office of German Affairs in the State Department, we were asked to review presidential papers from the summer of 1961 for potential
declassification, and we were asked to give a policy-level review because these were such high-level documents. And one of the things I remember from that is that certainly George Bundy, based on reporting from Berlin and from Bonn, tended to regard Willy Brandt not just as wanting a more forceful response, but as really rather bellicose, saber-rattling, and irresponsible. It is also quite true, and I think this has been fully documented in a recent book by a former American diplomat, Richard Smyser, that in fact the Kennedy administration, both the State Department and the White House, were actually prepared in 1961 to make much greater concessions on Berlin. And it's also quite obvious that Walter Ulbricht regarded the Berlin Wall as a compromise from what he wanted, which was the elimination of West Berlin. And so to push for a more forceful, more bellicose position at a time which was actually one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, not only could potentially risk a European conflict, but also could potentially risk the status of West Berlin and its limited freedoms and the ability of the Western Allies to protect that. Having been mayor of the city, governing mayor of the city for 4 years, I'm somewhat baffled, as I was baffled at the time, why Brandt would have been pressing for a more forceful response when the consequences of a more forceful response by the Western Allies almost certainly would have been worse than the wall and could have been catastrophically worse for West Berlin. I just don't understand this. Can you explain it?
I think, indeed, it was an exception. It was an exceptional situation, and it was one of the few situations in which Willy Brandt reacted more emotionally than rationally or real politically. But you have to have in mind that he had to walk a fine line between the angry, very angry reaction of the Berlin population, among them the students who tried to tear down the wall, really, to do this, and asked the Allies to do this, which would be very responsible, because no one knew how the East German police, army, Soviet Union would react. And so, but Willy Brandt had to calm down a little bit this popular furor, but he chose so to try so attacking the Allies, so looking for a scapegoat, you could say. Of course, Kennedy was right to answer, you don't want a Third World War, won't you? Will you? So it was, of course, he had no real alternative to offer, Willy Brandt, what to do, what the Allies should do to stop the construction of the Berlin Wall. So I think it was partially, we should explain it by emotion, and two, we should explain it as an attempt to calm down the Berlin population's furor. Because the letter was known publicly.
I have two remarks on that. One is on Walter Ulbricht. I've met Walter Ulbricht in 1970, in June 1970, with a delegation of young socialists for 2 hours. And one of the prominent subjects was Berlin, and he compared Berlin with Danzig, Gdansk. And he said at that time that the situation of Berlin could become the origin and the cause for the next war. And then came all the... But this is only to confirm your point of view. The second point was, which I discussed later. I didn't know Willy Brandt personally at that time. I discussed it from the hindsight with him. Because I discussed how I perceived the situation at that time, and he said how he reacted. This is but it's later. I reacted at that time. It was still the former policy of the United States was rollback. And as a youngster, which I was at that time, I perceived the weakness of that concept. And I thought the Allies were valid to defend us in case of a Soviet attack. Unification, overcoming the split of Germany, the troops of the United States were useless. This was my perception at that time. And that we could only do it on our own because they had rhetoric to overcome the division of Europe, and they had weapons, but they did nothing to back it up. And therefore, I thought, if they don't do anything, we, based on the capabilities to defend ourselves, should do something to talk to the East, to manage with the East. And I came from the Protestant church, so this was a very important point. And interesting enough, but this was 10 years later, Willy Brandt said, for very different reasons and very different circumstances, that he had developed his views in a similar direction. But I was not part of that discussion in 61.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back has been waiting very patiently. So, yeah, right.
Terry Murphy. I'm with CSIS, but I'm also an international lawyer. I actually waved off a couple times, but I'd like to come in on the comment that just before. I was not a very important person in that period. I was a very junior officer in the United States Navy, very junior officer in the United States Navy. But I was extended involuntarily for active service to save Berlin. The Navy kindly wrote my records to say that I volunteered, and I'll take that, but I don't remember it that way. I remember, I'm not a professional historian, I remember some of these issues a little more generously to Willy Brandt than, or even to the United States. I would regard the hero as the German people. The German people, and Willy Brandt was responding to that. Mut, courage, ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a donut. All those things were what brought America to the rescue of Berlin with young kids like me. And years and years and years later, I sat in a lovely restaurant in summertime Berlin with my wife, who works for a German company, and my gaze was taken, and she said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "I'm looking at all these normal, ordinary people." And she said, "What about them?" I said, "There's nothing about them. They're normal and ordinary, and they're here, and they're free." And Willy Brandt has a lot to be proud of, and people here who are honoring him have a lot to be proud of.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let's take that as a comment and go to the next, right up front here.
Thank you. My name is Fritz Fischer. I had the privilege of being the assistant of Willy Brandt for 3 years, from 1977 to 1980 in Bonn, in Willy Brandt's capacity as chairman of the North-South Commission, which at the time was proposed by Bob McNamara, and we had daily contact. I had my office next to his. I have one question to Mr. Rother. What was the purpose or the idea behind printing here his resignation letter on top of this leaflet? And then, with your indulgence, I'd like to add a few anecdotal remarks to illustrate what kind of person Willy Brandt was. But first of all, I think we should all acknowledge that it was Willy Brandt as Chancellor that founded the German Marshall Fund of the United States at the time, and Jerry Livingston knows that. To my knowledge, it was the only European country that benefited from the Marshall Plan that did that. And it was fortunately prolonged by Chancellor Kohl, which reflects a very good relationship between Helmut Kohl and Willy Brandt. Were exemplary. They were really very close. Now, as to the anecdotes, if one met with Willy Brandt, his desk was clear. There was no books, no files, no nothing. There was one sheet of paper with a few remarks. He had prepared himself for any visitor. And there were no phone calls. There were no interruptions at the time. So you really felt important as a visitor, and I think that psychologically was very good. He was extremely well informed about the rest of the world and the personalities and their background. And he was only, at the time when I worked with him, he had no CIA, he had no apparatus, just a few assistants in his office. But the intimate knowledge of persons was just amazing. I remember when we were in New York, he said, "I have to give a call to Hubert Humphrey because he's dying." So he talked to Hubert Humphrey, and Hubert Humphrey wrote him a very nice letter, and the letter arrived in Bonn at the desk of Willy Brandt when Hubert Humphrey had already passed away. He was very well informed. Once I saw him after midnight in Delhi, and he was writing a letter. He had the art of writing letters, handwritten letters. I mean, this is an art that has been forgotten now in a computer age. I just want to acknowledge that. And I said, "What do you do there?" He said, "I'm writing to the king of Nepal." I said, "Why do you that?" "Well, he has arrested the former prime minister when he came back out of exile. And because of that letter, this former prime minister was only put under house arrest." Dieter Detke mentioned a sense of protocol that kept him from seeing the president. I have a slightly different recollection, because Willy Brandt was very modest, but he also was very impressingly assertive of himself. So once we were traveling to Washington, and he asked me to ask our ambassador to prevent him from asking for an appointment with the president. Because he said, this president is so busy, and who am I as a private person to ask any of his precious time? The president will know that I am in town, and it's up to him to react. So when we left on Friday, we got a phone call on Thursday evening at 10:30 at night. They asked for our social security number, which we did not have. But so next morning at 11 o'clock, Carter received it, and Willy Brandt said to me, jokingly, "That's the way it works."
Thank you. I think I want to.
If I just can add one more thing, he was extremely loved worldwide, and there was a high esteem. And he told me about Brezhnev. Brezhnev had personally allowed that Willy Brandt, as chancellor, could fly to the Soviet Union with Air Force, with German Air Force. If you think what it means to see the Iron Cross over the Soviet Union, and when the plane had landed, and he insisted to have a group photo taken with the German crew. They had already switched into private clothing because they didn't know what. No, he said, "I want you in uniform," and this is indicative of the high admiration that Willy Brandt enjoyed worldwide, and it was a privilege to work with him. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I owe you an explanation for this, and I can only apologize for this decision of the publishing house. Well, this is the truth. We didn't choose this, and when I saw this, I only could hope that no one would read it, because it's a bad choice. It's a bad choice to reprint the letter of resignation on an order form, on a make advertisements for the Berlin edition with such a thing.
Thank you. Christina, Jerry Livingston is next on my list, and then Tom Hughes.
Thank you, Jerry Livingston. We could have used some battleships on the Wannsee in 1961, but I guess even though you stayed in the Navy, you weren't able to produce those. I've got three very short questions for Dr. Rother, and then one larger question for Carstens. My first, it relates also whether there are gaps. Do the papers show anything about the bribery of two CDU deputies, one or two CDU deputies, on the time of the no confidence vote in 1972, which saved Brandt's government? That's my first question. My second question, it's not just a prurient one, is do the papers show anything about Brandt's love life? This is not just prurient. I mean, of course, his love life was a factor in his fall in 1974. And lastly, maybe I don't recall correctly, but I seem to recall some years ago in the press reading about Brandt's second wife and her effort to retain a number of Brandt's papers and to block you people from... Third wife. So blocking you people from obtaining them. Is that recollection correct, and how did that play out? And my larger question really is to you, Carstens, when you spoke about Brandt's effort to prevent a split on the left. it seems to me one of the abiding problems of the SPD and of German politics is that, unlike the Christian Democrats, who have been able to prevent any party on their right, the SPD has been unable to prevent a party on its left. And one of the main factors in that, it may not have been Brandt, but it was certainly Helmut Schmidt, was that it failed to incorporate the rising environmental movement in the 1970s, and as a result, the Green Party entered the German Bundestag. And now, of course, the party has got a double problem because you've got Oscar Lafontaine's, or formerly Oscar Lafontaine's party of the left on your left. So it does seem to me that Brandt's efforts in the 1970s to prevent another factor on the SPD's left were unavailing.
According to all testimonies, Willy Brandt was not involved in this bribery of various CDU-CSU deputies. Herbert Wehner once, 2 years after or 3 years after, stated that this was a work done by him and his aide Karl Wienand on the West German side. Then we have the East German side. Of course, there was no involvement of any West German politician organized by Markus Wolf. And now it appears that also the KGB, perhaps using the Stasi, East German secret intelligence, was involved in this effort to save the social liberal coalition, and so some CDU-CSU deputies might have collected money twice or three times. Let us, let us about his love life. This is the only case in which his widow, third wife, still retains the documents. I can understand this. She's in her 60s, and she has no intention to be confronted with this. This is a private thing. I know that in the case of various presidents in the United States, practice is different here. But in the case of John F. Kennedy, it took 40 years nearly to get access to his love letters and medical records, etc. And Willy Brandt passed away 20 years ago, roughly. So perhaps we only have to wait, but this is not the fundamental interest of us as historians, acknowledging that things like this influence, as we know from the Guillaume case, that not Willy Brandt but others tried to use such things, relations, extramarital relations, hoping that they could press on Willy Brandt. But it's true that these love letters, if they exist, I couldn't check this, obviously, I haven't seen them, are still under custody of his widow, which is not true for the other part, 99% of the documents. There was a harsh dispute, conflict between the Social Democratic Party and the widow directly after Willy Brandt's death, but the compromise was the establishing of our foundation. And we have unrestricted access.
Insofar as this question of integrating a movement or cooperating with a party is concerned, because this is the alternative. After the policy failed to integrate the environmentalist movement, the real challenge was to open a path for cooperation with them. And with support of Willy Brandt, Imke was involved as well. I was part of a discussion group with the Greens in the 80s to elaborate on the possibility of future cooperation. And one of the main obstacles at that time was foreign and security policy. Because not only NATO, they were even against the European Union. And I will not say it so. They had very extreme positions, sometimes more extreme than the present left-wing party. But it was a different type of movement. It was more anarchistic. And it took a long time before they accepted a valid position. And to a certain degree, they have changed so much that I'm no longer sure whether they are left of the SPD. I think they are, in all likelihood, they are now in many respects on a different way. Now the question, and this is nothing to do with Willy Brandt, but it's natural to do with the concept. After this other party is there, I had a meeting last week with one of the leading representatives of that party, who is open for reforms. So it could not have been Oscar Lafontaine. And we discussed the possibility of a series of discussions, especially on the issue on NATO, European Union issues, and sending German troops abroad. These are three major issues where, at present time, on federal level, which makes at present time the cooperation on federal level with the left-wing party impossible, and will make it impossible until they change on these three subjects. And I think some of them are conscious of that fact, but it's a minority, and therefore it will take time.
Thank you. We're rapidly running out of time. Let's see if we can get in a few more questions and comments. First, Tom Hughes, and then the gentleman on the right there. Tom?
Just a quick comment about the 1961 situation. At that point, I was Deputy Director of INR in the State Department, and the atmospherics in Washington were not very conducive to a very thoughtful handling of the building of the wall. Kennedy had already suffered through the Bay of Pigs, the tough time with Khrushchev in Vienna, and all of a sudden he's at Hyannisport in August when the wall goes up. And Eleanor Dulles, for some reason or other, had adopted Berlin as the spokesman in Washington. Kennedy thought the Dulleses had disappeared. He wanted them to disappear. And the first thing he hears about the wall is that Eleanor is busy raising all kinds of tantrums around town with the press. And this set off Mac Bundy, among other people. Inside the State Department, she followed Marty Hillenbrand into the men's room to belabor him about the weak response. But outside, her activity was also considerable. And this had something to do with Mac Bundy's notion that Brandt was being bellicose. She had adopted Berlin, and therefore she had adopted Brandt. Yeah. And whether Brandt knew that he'd been adopted by Eleanor, I'm not sure. But in any case, that was an element in the picture. Let me go back to a question that occurred to me earlier and ask Karsten. I think I heard him say that Brandt's first visit to the United States was 1954. And I wonder what the auspices were of the visit. Can you tell us anything about what he did and where he went? I know that he became a Texas colonel thanks to the Republican governor of Texas, Alan Shivers, and that's about the only thing I can remember from that period. Was there any carryover at that point from his OSS connection before? Any connection already with the CIA? Or
no.
What can you tell us about the visit?
That visit had to do with the delegation of the leadership of the Social Democratic Party to the United States, and he was the contact person, because of his Berlin position, the contact person of the Social Democratic Party to the United States anyhow. And at that time, there were several occasions when he wanted to go to the United States before that, but he really first time with that delegation in '54. I think Fritz Erler was on that group. Was in that group as well. And he was already seen with his position because of Berlin as being very, very pro-American. Schumacher, after World War II was extremely, I would say, nationalistic and skeptical about the United States. But Schumacher was at that time already dead. But Willy Brandt therefore went relatively late to the United States, seen with today's eyes.
Basruddin, would you like to add anything? You were present at the time as well, watching.
Yeah, I was present at most of these, but you've had a substantially correct account up to now. I wouldn't like to comment further.
Very good. Yes.
My name is Walter Landry. I have a small think tank on in self-determination of peoples. I have a definite interest in it. I wrote I was in the Marine Corps in the Korean War, and before and after the conflict ended. I was there when it was about to end and stayed on for several more months. That was the only time I got exempt from my income taxes. But anyway, President Truman at that time was president, and there was a proposal to have self-determination of peoples put in the UN Charter. It was Molotov who proposed it, and Truman didn't see anything wrong with it, and so it was put in. And there's been a lot of comment about it since, but it seems that Molotov's wife was Jewish, and he had a problem, and he had a little personal interest. I won't go into any detail on that.
How does it relate to the papers
I want to
or to
relate
Willy
it
Brandt?
to Willy Brandt. The question is this. What was Willy Brandt's position on having self-determination of peoples in the UN Charter? It was proposed in CIF 45 and went into the Charter. What was his position on that?
Thank you. Anybody like?
I don't remember any specific comment made by Willy Brandt on this problem. I will check it.
Christina.
I promise you that I will check it. I have your card. So.
Yes, thank you. Steve White, Mount St. Mary's University. It seems that we're getting an image here of Brandt both as very willful in some instances, but has this remarkable capacity to grow. And I want to go back to his early years. If I heard right, you had said that he was hostile to parliamentarism very early on. So my question is, what were the grounds of that early hostility, and then what was it that turned that around?
Thank you.
Well, the grounds were his experience with the Weimar Republic. Well, of course, this is not an automatic conclusion everyone made, but this was his conclusion, especially, well, he saw himself, as many young socialists, from generation to generation, it repeats, as a revolutionary socialist, but not communist style. And in the 20s, there were differences between revolutionaries, which were communist and which were non-communist. And he was very disappointed with the SPD policies during the Weimar Republic. Perhaps you know this then very famous slogan that republic is not much, we want socialism. And finally, in 1931, he participated in as a 17-year-old young socialist in this party split. So this was his initial integration into a left-wing, left socialist organization, which remained very small. I think more interesting is how he not came back, but because he hadn't been ever parliamentary in favor of parliamentarism, but how he came to parliamentarism. And this was his Scandinavian experience, which came parallel to the transformation of the Norwegian Workers' Party, which, as if you are interested in these things, you might know that the Norwegian Workers' Party didn't belong to the Socialist Workers' International, as it was called then. It belonged to the so-called 2.5 International of left socialist parties, and it was among the few important in their country, important parties which hadn't joined neither Communist International nor Socialist International, which tried to find a third way on the left. And in the 30s, they transformed into a reformist party. And this was a time when Willy Brandt was there. And so he participated in these conflicts, discussions. And he learned not out of history, but out of participating in this. He was a member of the Norwegian Workers' Party then, out of participating in this transformation. He learned to acknowledge the value of parliamentary strategy.
By the way, there is still a remnant of that. What we know today is that the majority of the Workers' Council in the German Revolution were dominated by Social Democrats and independent Social Democrats and not by communists as in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And secondly, what is also true at that time in the 20s and 30s in Norway, they discussed Workers' Council as supplement to parliament, the parliamentary system. And what we have seen in the post-war German discussion with the co-determination issue and the Workers' Council, which we have integrated, is to integrate elements of the collective representation of workers into a reformist and a parliamentary system. So this specific German tradition of representation has to do with, in a certain way, with this integration of in the beginning, revolutionary concept into a reformist one and into a legal system.
Good. We're just about out of time. I know Jerry has one small final addendum. And anybody else? Any comments or questions? Then we'll final.
Thank you very much for letting me talk once again. This is just a contemporary Mark Karsten. I wonder what you would think. I have the feeling that today the antipathy for European socialism and the Western European welfare state is more pronounced in this country than it's ever been before. It is a leading argument advanced by the entire leadership of the Republican Party and Glenn Beck of the Fox News Channel and virtually all the Tea Party people on the right, that Obama is leading this country to become a West European socialist or social democratic welfare state. And it does seem to me this reflects a widespread view in the country.
If I may answer in an indirect way without interfering into your domestic debate, when there are two major changes where Germany has changed and where the United States has changed. The one change is the domestic aspect. In the 50s and 60s, when I grew up, the polarization in Germany between left and right was extreme. And the amount of ideology which was expressed in this process of polarization was enormous. Today, we have difficulties very often to distinguish the major parties inside Germany from one another. And because we have elections, and during elections you need polarization, we have a lack of polarization in a certain way. Insofar as we can achieve a lot because we have consensus, but we have a lack of polarization, and therefore fringe parties are at least have a certain likelihood to go up. On the other side, in the United States, you have now, it did not start now, it's already a longer process in Congress. You have a very high degree of polarization in Congress. You have the independents, but you have a very high degree, an increasing degree over years of polarization in Congress, combined with a high level of ideologization. This is the first difference where I think Germany has changed and the United States has changed. The second where I see a change is in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Germans were known to have angst. The one part of Germany had angst because they feared a Soviet attack. The other part had angst because they thought they might be defended. This is the correlation between deterrence and self-deterrence when you take it in strategic terms. After 9/11, for the first time, I had to explain American angst to Germans. And when you now look on statistics, Americans are more concerned about international relations and many other security issues than Germans are.
Thank you. We will have to leave it at that. Thank you to the panelists for a very rich discussion of this important document collection and series, Willy Brandt, Berliner Ausgabe. Thank you also for this rich discussion about Willy Brandt and his life and legacy. Thank all of you for your comments and questions. It's been, I think, a very good 2 hours. Thank you for spending that time with us here. Again, also thanks to the co-sponsors, including the German Historical Institute and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. We're adjourned. Thank you very much.